In the early 20th century, English explorers were out to see parts of the world no one had ever seen. They wanted to go to lost cities in the Amazon and discover the South Pole and cross the Antarctica. And they were tough people. One such explorer was Ernest Shackleton, who in 1914 made his third expedition to Antarctica with the goal of crossing the continent on foot with 5 other men. To get there, he had to sail a ship, this ship, in fact, with 27 others, his crew to the Weddell Sea, to the edge of Antarctica. The name of this ship was the Endurance. On January 18th, 1915, the ship froze in icy waters off the coast of Antarctica. An unexpected south wind blew in and froze it solid in place. Now, Shackleton was an experienced military man. He was a sailor. At age 24, he had been a full master in the Merchant Marine. He had led soldiers into the Boer War at 26. And this wasn't the race to the pole. Britain had wanted to be the first, but the Norwegians were the first in 1911. Shackleton wanted to cross Antarctica on foot. It became his obsession. So his crew and the Endurance were stuck in this piece of ice, which was floating away from their target as they tried to free the ship. They tried to build fires to melt the ice. They tried to chip away at it, and the ice grew and grew and grew and grew. It was stuck in this huge chunk of floating ice, and they were carried 670 miles off course. Shackleton's crew were busy doing all kinds of activities. They were building furniture and hunting and playing soccer and taking the dogs on races and all kinds of things. Everyone, no matter rank, pitched in to keep everyone well and busy. And then disaster struck. Winter came. Minus 17 degrees during the day, no light, minus 30 at night. At one point, the ship tilted because a wave moved this huge ice 30 degrees, and they had to eat with their feet against the side of the ship when they sat in the mess. By October, the Endurance was snapped in half by moving, shifting ice, and the men took refuge on the ice itself. That night, Shackleton wrote, "A man must shape himself to a new mark directly after the old one goes to ground. I pray to God," he said, "I can manage to get the whole party to civilization." After the Endurance was crushed, they decided they would march across ice 350 miles, dragging whaleboats toward a storehouse that Shackleton knew of. After the first afternoon, they had marched just a mile. By the third day, they were hip-high in snow. They decided to hunker down with their boats as shelter 4 miles from the Endurance camp on a 20-foot thick ice floe. They named it Ocean Camp. Now, Ocean Camp was vulnerable to changes, groans, and crashes of the ice. They recovered most of the food and harvest nails from this mess of a wreck, tarps and sails. By November, the boat had broken into the sea. The spot where this ship lay was covered over by ice, and no thing remained but desolation. Their drift continued until they were 180 miles from safety. And on Christmas Day, they had a feast And then they pulled their boats 7 days' march. They made it 7.5 miles. They had 42 days of food. They stopped, built another camp they called Patience Camp. By April 1916, 15 months after the freezing of the Endurance, they launched lifeboats in search of land. They crossed dangerous waters that tossed them around. They slept on smaller ice floes that moved during the night. One night, an ice floe broke in half and dropped a man in his sleeping bag deep into the water that they had to rescue in the dark. Killer whales encircled them, squalls and ice and snow and frostbite and thirst and waves and -7 degrees at night threatened their lives. They drifted off course 30 miles, so they changed plans. They aimed for a bay. Finally, 3 boats and 28 men hit Elephant Island, a small island off of Antarctica. No shelter. They were there, tattered and worn, with their boats and some tarps and their gear. Shackleton decided he would take 5 of his men and go ahead to South Georgia Island, an island that's only 100 miles long and southeast of the tip of South America. Shackleton and his men were 800 miles from South Georgia Island. They decided that these 6 men would try to go in a 22-foot boat with 6 weeks of food, navigational tools, and a will to survive to hit this tiny spot in the island. A harrowing traverse. They had to chip away ice from the boat. Men were near death. They traveled for 2 weeks. Their water was contaminated. They couldn't swallow anything, so they couldn't eat. When they were 80 miles from South Georgia Island, they realized they had to go all the way around it, 150 miles, to get to the whaling port where they might find safety. And then a hurricane hit. It took them days to land, and they chose to make landfall on the western side of the island. When they finally crawled up onto land, they said they saw their first plant life in 17 months. Shackleton said, "We heard the gurgling sound. We found a stream, and on our knees we drank pure water." Now, the whaling port was on the island, but 29 miles on the other side of the island if you went overland. There was only one small problem, and that was there were 10,000-foot peaks that no one had ever crossed between them and the whaling port. So 3 of them went on. They climbed the mountains, they descended. At one point, they decided to create a sled, and they shot down 1,500 feet in minutes. A day and a half it took them, and they reached the whaling station where a Norwegian captain who was a friend of Shackleton could hardly recognize him. They were so soiled and beaten. And the captain told him about World War I and how it had been in full swing. 3 days later, Shackleton found a ship to get his crew. They sailed south to Elephant Island, but they couldn't get within 60 miles due to ice. So he sailed 500 miles north to the Falkland Islands, cabled London, but there were no ships because it was World War I. They finally found a suitable vessel by September. But when they got there, they couldn't reach the island. They got within 100 miles of Elephant Island, and they had to turn back. By August, which was midwinter, they made a 4th attempt at rescuing the 22 men who had stayed on Elephant Island, and at this point, they had luck. As they approached, they could see the camp where the men were. Shackleton said he stood on the bow of the ship and he counted 1, 2, 3, up to 22. And he called out, "Are you well?" And they answered, "We are all well, boss." And then he says, I heard cheers. Shackleton somehow saved all of his men when he could have given up on the whole endeavor. 15 of those 28 who were in his crew returned to England and left soon after for the front of World War I. Why did they survive? The genius of leadership, the ability to adapt, the force of personality, the ability to keep their spirits up, loyalty, maybe love. I would say they survived because of a kind of faith that was patient and knew that the namesake of that lost ship was their highest spiritual value: endurance. The ability to keep going, to plow through, to patiently wait, to work toward a goal, or as the poet said in today's reading, to know a sweet inward silence of the wait itself. Now, I'm guessing none of us will ever be in a Shackleton-like endeavor. I hope none of us will. But all of us will know the need for endurance, physical or spiritual or emotional. We all know the need for patience. I have heard your stories, so I know this is true. I have heard about getting sober, about getting healthy, about getting trained for a new job, about transitioning gender, about grief, about aging, about parenting. All these things have one thing in common. They only succeed with endurance. They are not just enduring. They don't require us just to endure them like pain or abuse or dehumanizing forces. They require endurance, the spiritual urge to continue, the push and the pull of moving forward and requiring patience. There's a Japanese haiku by Kobayashi Issa that goes, "O snail, climb Mount Fuji, but slowly, slowly." In a world where we demand instantaneous results, there are great important things to do in life. However small we feel, however frail we feel, however stacked the odds are against us. And at the same time, there is more to life than speed. Because speed is useless against a mountain, against a disease, against the long haul in life, against personal change. Speed doesn't help with the difficulties we face that must be faced head on. Things that aren't resolved easily. We often turn to frustration because frustration demands speed. Frustration is the thing that seeks to put us in charge of our lives and stamps the foot of the soul and demands control over things, often when we have no control. Can you imagine Shackleton's level of frustration and what he had to tamp down to survive? Joan Chittister, the Catholic nun and activist who Kathleen read, says, "What frustrates me is anything that obstructs my intent to wrench the world to my will." Down deep, she said, frustration is not about the project at hand. It is my will that this is about. It is my internal insistence that my will be satisfied at all costs and immediately. Then I become a whimpering, silly kind of thing where only the strong can possibly prevail. I think she's telling us that sometimes a little less insistence on our part in the midst of just about anything and a little more endurance is the right balance to making change. Now, one of my mottos, which anybody who works for me will tell you is true, is keep going. By that I mean that life is not a series of sprints, but a marathon of adaptations and changes that if we give up on easily, we lose purpose and we lose hope. Shackleton's values prove this with little optimism, with some care of his men, with shifting his responses in each changing circumstance, with his commitment to the people, not to the mission, but without abandoning the mission, he could find a spiritual endurance that pulled him along. He made commitments until he couldn't keep them, and he had to adapt. He remained optimistic and he remained realistic. But he did it with endurance. Because nothing will resolve itself without endurance and patience and the spirit of relishing time and adapting and change. Whatever the project, whatever we're engaged in, whether we're trying to make our marriages work, or trying to make our families happier, or our lives more filled with purpose, or if we're trying to end racism or ensure that women can make choices about their bodies, or just about anything, the lesson is that endurance is needed. Endurance, says Chittister, is when it comes to life projects and activism requires three things, she says, to be confronted. One is that what is, that we can't be defeated before the match. And two, that some things that don't change or are outside of our control mean that we can't change them, require patience and faith to trust the future. And three, she says, some things can only be chipped away at one generation at a time. So to see a long project requires endurance. We live and work to make the world safe for others often. She says patience, or the patient endurance, climbs on, putting our lives in God's hands. We do consistently and faithfully what must be done to make this world a better place. No, we may not get credit for doing it, and that in itself drains our efforts of the corrosive pride. We trust only that our creating God will gather all the small pieces of effort and someday bring them together in a great new view of the world. Then we discover the power of patience. Endurance, I say, believes beyond all reasonable reason that goodness can prevail. And that is the measure of the strength of the soul. In 1921, a few years after his rescue in Antarctica, Shackleton set off on a new expedition to Antarctica. He took with him 8 of his previous crew, and after a mild heart attack on the way, to which he waved off help, by some amazing coincidence, Shackleton died docked in the very same whaling station on South Georgia Island where he had once managed his crew's rescue. He was 47 years old. His obit in the New York Times on January 31st, 1922, quoted him saying, "We had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed, groveled yet grasped at glory, grown bigger in the fullness of the whole. We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man." The obit described that when Shackleton had departed with the Endurance from England, Queen Alexandra had given him and the ship a Bible. And the one page that Shackleton had saved through all of that turbulence in his life was a page from the book of Job that read, "Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath garnered it? The waters are hid as with a stone in the face of the deep which is frozen." For him, that page, I imagine, was a reminder that God is always bigger than we are, that time is always beyond us, that life is a marathon with no certain ends, that there are only small steps toward our goals, acts of kindness, loves of causes, commitments to change, hopes for each other, and people over missions, which all require the spiritual value of endurance. Endurance is the unsung champion of the spiritual life that leads in part to authenticity. It is what covenants are made of, promises to stick together whether we are a struggling couple or family or faith that disagrees on one thing or another, or a country that is torn by division. Endurance says that when we feel we are living in times we have never imagined, the longer, slower view is required. It means that our work is never ceasing here in this church and in our lives. And because we are Unitarians, we are called to use the spiritual value of endurance, to make a place for all people, to hold out for progressive values that don't dehumanize anyone, to love, not to pray without ceasing, and to look into the mirror that endurance creates within us, to see our true natures, whether we are lost in Antarctica or wrestling with life in Dallas or some other place. We are called to endurance. May you each find even a fraction of Shackleton's faith to face what you must with patience, with hope. May you each live authentic spiritual lives. Our hope for you today and every day. Amen.